The character that Adanir spoke about, Zia al-Haq, played a very critical role in the massacres in Jordan of the Palestinian Liberation Organization in the 70s. And so historically and regularly dating back to the 1800s, Zionist movements and militias, later turned Israeli state, played a very critical role in the Arab world. So I'll parse through the nature and history of Israeli wars vis-a-vis the Arab world and the relevance of Wikileaks and the Palestine Papers, starting off with a diary quote from David Ben-Gurion, who wrote, and I quote, "What is necessary is cruel and strong reactions. We need precision in time, place, and casualties. If we know the family, we must strike mercilessly, women and children included. Otherwise, the reaction is inefficient. At the place of action, there is no need to distinguish between guilty and innocent. Where there was no attack, we should not strike." Where there was no attack does not refer to attack by the Palestinians, but by the Israelis. The leadoff should not be the Israeli attack, should be the Israeli attack, a brutal one on a smaller scale. The response must happen so as to become the cause for the ultimate attack and the massacre. It's in fact the Israeli identity, and it hasn't wavered since the inception of Zionism. And it's the identity of the eternal righteous victim fighting for its life, which needs for its campaign two things: a constant threat and a constant fight as the premise for constant expansion. And now, as we see the unraveling of the proxy colonial system in Egypt, Tunisia, and the calls for its undoing throughout the Arab world, Israelis feel the need to be and encourage their governments to remain the undefeated victim, because they are in this fabricated sea of enemies, which WikiLeaks and the Al Jazeera Palestine paper leaks have shown is really a sea of allies running states of people who are subversive to the US-Israeli interests, subservient and in fact to those interests, kept subjugated in an effort to buy time for the Israeli-US agenda to expand. And Israeli expansion has consistently been favored by the Israeli government and the Israelis en masse over the so-called Israeli stability, a point also confirmed in the recent leaks. The mechanisms employed, whether it was the negotiations or these secret attacks, secret insofar as they're not disclosed by European and American media, are tools to buy time to increase the expansion, to create facts on the Palestinian ground, which they then say are impossible to reverse, in hopes of finalizing the ethnic cleansing project and forcing the acceptance of the imposed artificial state, which will and had been supported through fictional narratives, which we in the US and Europe are inundated with without alternative. Israeli policy has always been to ethnically cleanse, using layered forms of oppression and massacre, dripping at times and pouring at others, as we saw in Lebanon in 2006 and the Christmas massacres of 2008, building with it an intellectual, media, and political campaign that is mirrored and absorbed in the US and furthered through US domestic and international policy. And the leaks become relevant not for the Arab masses, as the leaks, in my opinion, have done nothing to spark or played any role in the liberation movements we see unfurling. It's relevant to some degree to the American and European masses who've been victims of falsified facts and distorted concepts. So when we say Israeli expansion, we don't mean simply land expansion throughout Palestine, even though that's a critical part of it, but we also refer to the equally vital resources which are shared in the Fertile Crescent and beyond: oil, water, trade routes, production, markets, and so on, all of which are tied to the neighboring states. And so the Israelis are just as interested in those national resources, the neighboring Arab countries, as they are in cementing and expanding their grip on the Palestinian lands. And so the Israeli expansion is to both the native Palestinian and the surrounding Arab lands, which must become permanent, or at least permanent, until the threat is removed, and that threat is the very existence of the Palestinian, his demands, which carry into the consciousness of the Arab people, his suffering, which is a reminder to the Arab people of the threat of Israeli war should people not cooperate with the regimes under which they are forced to live. A prime example is the public revelation, I think it was today or yesterday, by Al Jazeera, that the Egyptian government has been selling oil to the Israelis at a price lower than its own expenses, essentially paying Israelis to take oil from Egypt. And so either last night or this morning, the pipelines leading into Israel were bombed. So as far as Israel is concerned, or as far as the Palestinian people and the Arab people are concerned, the profound hatred of democracy, I think, is an accurate description, maybe a little simplistic, but accurate nonetheless. The Arab population, the democracy for the Arab population, who would otherwise seek to restore or nationalize their resources, as we saw with Jamal Abdel Nasser, is in complete and direct contradiction to Israeli-American interests. And an imperative part of the relationship is the creation and the continuation of the common enemy between the US, Israel, and the European governments. And so before the Muslims and the Brotherhood were all terrorists, all Arabs were terrorists, all Palestinians were terrorists, and then as the nationalist movements waned and Islamism took hold, every Muslim became a terrorist. I'm a bit disappointed to see that Michael Ratner isn't here with us tonight, but it makes sense, because I wanted to talk very briefly and tangentially about the way that this creation of the common enemy and these wars that are necessary to cement US-Israeli hegemony over the Arab world play out right here, and how the US justice system is used. In fact, in one of the WikiLeaks, I believe it was Gabi Ashkenazi who thanked, I don't recall which congressperson, for using their national security agency to target people in the United States. So a lot of the arrests of Palestinians that happen in the US, these so-called terrorists, begin in Israel by Israeli government officials targeting activists. So there's been historically, and this is dating back to the 70s under Nixon and probably even before, selective prosecution, selective targeting of Arabs or those who are fighting for the liberation of Palestine or organizing for Palestinian liberation in the United States. And the Supreme Court has historically affirmed the right of the executive government to selectively prosecute and punish foreign nationals, even dual citizens, to implement foreign policy within the United States. And so I hope that as people read the news about the so-called terrorists and all of these entrapment cases, that we keep this in mind and that this is something that we mobilize about, because the weakest victim is in fact the political prisoner, whether he's in Palestine or in the United States. And in the US, here we have some power to mobilize against that. So I'd like to give a very cursory and very brief, because it seems there's an advanced audience here, account of Israeli wars against the Arabs, going as far back, if you will, very cursory, as the 1800s. Because what I hope to convey is that pattern, and we can together get out of the language of, you know, these attacks were in response to. So starting at a random... I'm sorry. And it's this very pattern of terrorism that the Zionists early on, and then later the Israeli state afflicted, that really helped foment the subjugation of the Arab people, as we see in Egypt and Tunisia, in exchange for the so-called peace with Israel, buttressed these Arab dictators who further used the Palestinian struggle, whether it's through taking part in the negotiations or direct financial aid, as a fig leaf and as a reminder to the Arab masses the threat that they face should they not continue with this dictatorship, which is in peace with Israel, from the Israeli war. And we see that again unraveling right now, a little less than a century of terrorism inflicted across the Arab world by the Zionist forces in coalition with the US government. So a random beginning, the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire had a mandate over, well, the Ottoman Empire was in control of Palestine, the British took over, and very early on, Zionist organizations began negotiating with the British. Chaim Weizmann promised verbatim a colonial outpost in Palestine. 1917, the Balfour Declaration promising a Jewish state in Palestine. Lord Balfour openly admitting that, yes, we have dismissed the wishes of the Arab majority, but we must dismiss them because our interests are a far greater import in the future. The disarming of the Palestinian people, the training and the arming of the Zionist forces, Herzl's project of spiriting away, in his own words, spiriting away the penniless population out of Palestine, taking over the land, ensuring that they could not sustain themselves from the land, which the majority of which, before 1858, was owned communally. So they couldn't sustain themselves by producing from the land, and were also denied employment. 1936 to 1939, there was a general strike, an Arab uprising, crushed by the British. April 48, well, late 40s, the policies of land confiscation and disenfranchisement and the small bouts of violence turned into a really organized policy of violent ethnic cleansing across Palestine, the most desirable areas first, the coastal territories. November 1947, the UN announces the Partition Plan, which was advocated in large part by the United States, which by then had emerged as a new superpower post-World War II. And so the vote was delayed by the US as they lobbied South American states to vote in favor of the Partition Plan. So shortly thereafter, Britain declares that May 15th, 1948 will be the withdrawal date. Immediately after that declaration, Irgun, Stern, Haganah, Lehi began attacking, and ultimately, well, one of the major massacres, April 9th, 1948, they weren't just the massacres, but they were shows and acts to terrorize the people, which we see repeated today by holding people out in the square and targeting the elderly and children. 700,000 Palestinians became refugees living a few feet away. Arab armies attacked after seeing this, and in April of 1949 at Luzon, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and the Palestinians tried to negotiate with the now Israeli state, and the Israelis refused, asking, as they do now, for an interim truce and refusing to acknowledge Palestinian self-determination. 1956, Jamal Abdel Nasser tries to nationalize the Suez Canal, immediately attacked by Israel, Great Britain, France. The US was not very happy because they weren't in on the deal, and they helped broker a ceasefire, and UN forces took over the canal. 1964, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was formed, the perfect cover, as we'll see. 1967, Jamal Abdel Nasser again expelled the UN troops. Egyptian troops took back the Suez, immediately attacked by Israel. Right before the Israeli attack, Israeli government officials had contacted Lyndon B. Johnson and said, hey, we're about to get attacked. We see this coming. I don't think our army is going to be able to sustain itself. Why don't you give us some weapons? To which Johnson replied, I think that you can whip the hell out of them, because the Central Intelligence Agency and the defense, well, but the DCI had already been keeping tabs on Israel's military capacity and found that Israel had enough weapons and a large enough army to secure four fronts and to still be victorious, and they were. And after that, Israel took over the Sinai, West Bank, Gaza, South Lebanon, and within a few years began building settlements, the same settlements that we talk about in the West Bank. 1973, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat tries to negotiate with Golda Meir, land for peace. She refuses. War, it was a failure. Sinai disengagement agreement created a buffer zone and an expanded buffer zone across the Sinai Peninsula. And this is not to mention all of the other covert operations that the Israelis were undertaking throughout Africa and throughout the Arab world. In southern Sudan, they began funding the militias there, supporting the militias there, going as far back as the 1950s, the Kurds in Iraq, the Maronite Christians in Lebanon, because the weakened, excuse me, And because the weakened Arab states by that time had really tired, had been exhausted of all of these wars with Israel, we saw a rise in the activities of the PLO, which was the only remaining force to defend the Palestinians, who were still being ethnically cleansed by compulsion and murder, targeted assassinations, not just in Palestine. They were being targeted and killed across the Arab world, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Tunisia, and elsewhere. So 1978, Israel invades Lebanon, puts in power Major Haddad's militia, massacre in the town of Khiyam, in which they remained until 2000. Khiyam became the home of one of the most notorious Israeli prisons in Lebanon. July 1981, skirmishes continue. The PLO is now based in the southern part of Lebanon for the most part. Skirmishes continue. July 1981, well, there had been a ceasefire negotiated with the US. July 1981, Israel violates the ceasefire. First time, second time, third time, God knows how many times. The PLO wouldn't respond. They couldn't get a rise out of the Palestinian or the Lebanese people. And so Yitzhak Shamir remembers that in 1982, he states that the danger we faced in 1982 was the lack of war against Israel and the proximity of political solutions. And so we had to undermine the position of the moderates within the PLO ranks to block the PLO peace offensive and to end political respectability and to safeguard the occupation of the West Bank, end quote. The UN Security Council, the UN Security Council called for a two-state solution on the pre-1967 borders. The US immediately vetoed it. I'm not gonna go through all of the massacres, 2006, war on Lebanon, all of it premised in the same pattern of attack until you get the smallest rise, massacre until you can get as many resources, and if they're not direct resources which we can use, then it's something to negotiate with, and it's a message to the rest of the Arab world. So for over 50 years, as we've seen throughout the history, I mean, because what Wikileaks really reveals is what a detailed reading of history would reveal. The US has been a key player in blocking any peaceful settlement to the Palestinian issue, and in fact, and instead facilitated Israeli attacks as a means of evading the issue. And they've never been an honest broker, needless to say. Despite the fact that the Arab League called for normalization, despite the fact that Hamas was willing to accept a very pathetic two-state solution, despite the fact, as we see from the Palestine papers and the Al Jazeera leaks, that Saeb Erekat, the chief Palestinian negotiator, is begging for increased restrictions, is giving away Jerusalem en masse, is welcoming attacks on Gaza along with Mahmoud Abbas, is being trained by British M16 forces and General Dayton to quell and kill any dissent within Palestine and outside of Palestine. Still, there was, according to the Israelis, no partner in peace. That's because there is no peace that they wanted to partner with. So I'm not going to go over, I can go over some of the WikiLeaks, you know, Kristen Gillibrand, along with other US congressmen, being told in November 2009 of Israeli plans to launch another and greater war in Gaza, their admission that they killed 1,400 people in that 22-day massacre, and their insistence that they not be stopped or sanctioned or obstructed from conducting this war in Gaza and in Lebanon. The skirmishes that they tried to incite across the Lebanese border when there was the controversy of the Special Tribunal for Lebanon brewing amidst possibilities of a civil war, all of which failed, fortunately. So there's a lot to be said, and this relates to WikiLeaks only in so much as it's a vindication to the Arabs and Palestinians who for years have been dismissed as either radicals or conspiracy theorists. Living, you know, generation after generation, living under proxy colonial regimes in the Arab world and under brutal and calculated campaigns of ethnic cleansing, using peace negotiations as a cover by the Israelis in the Palestinian territories. Not going into the highlights, I'm going to wrap up just because I think I'm getting close to time. Yeah. So As far as the US and Israel is concerned, self-determination and democracy has historically, since the late 1800s, mid-1900s, been acceptable only when it weakens the Arab states. As we see in southern Sudan in December, by the way, the southern Sudanese forces, before the referendum was even over, met with the Israelis. The Israelis promised them fleets of helicopters and plan on building their embassies, and that's going to become directly relevant, I believe, to any independent Egypt that we see in the near future. What's also important to take from both the Wiki and Al Jazeera leaks is the coordination between the Arab dictators and the Israeli-US government, coordination between Saudi Arabia and Egypt to attack Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and even the less aligned soft states like Qatar, simply because they house Al Jazeera. And the Arab regime's use of the Palestinian struggle, whether again it is to join in this fake cover of negotiations, and the price that the Arab masses have paid to really keep Israel in existence, this artificially imposed supremacist state that is literally feeding off the resources of the Arab masses and the blood of the Palestinians. And all of which brings us back to its identity, the foundation and the principles of Zionist movements, their European and American supporters and facilitators. And the US will happily join any war to keep its interests in place and to keep Israel alive, at the cost of our economic welfare, at the cost of American soldiers. And I hope Americans, through reading these WikiLeaks, if they are, can now understand why the Arabs blame us. This is why the Arabs blame you. In Tunisia, people early on had signs, US, stay out of this, because everybody knows what to expect. And we hope that the neo-colonial structures unravel, of course, as everybody has said, in Tunis, Egypt, and hopefully spread to Jordan, Yemen, and Palestine, that we'll find neighbors here to support the Arab demand for self-determination and call for the end of US-Israeli domination of the Arab world as the first step to becoming closer to a world where imperialist interests don't dominate. And again, I hope that people here question the so-called terrorist cases and the raids and the arrests, and not act simply for the sake of the Arabs and the Muslims and their allies who are being targeted, but really this is an assault that's been happening for 40 years on our very own constitutional rights over and over again. And it's, at the risk of sounding cliche, it's a matter of who's next for the sake of corporate and military interests. And we have to be clear that just because we enjoy at whatever period of time some perceived form of freedom, that doesn't mean that it's going to be here to last. It all depends on what new pattern empire will take. And on that note, thank you very much for your time.